Hi everyone. Today in this tutorial we are going to look at the creation of a visual component, how to reuse it in an application, and also it's going to be the situation where within the same project with the same data model we are going to have multiple UI applications manipulating and dealing with this same data model. That's a very powerful feature in the Olympe platform. Meaning, like, you don't need to have a single application within your project. You can have as many as you want, each one doing specific and different actions on the data. So let's create a project and we are going to name it bookmarks. And what this application is going to do, we had already a tutorial that deals with bookmarks. It's like a bookmark manager, what you save. Here we are going to do like a very simple bookmark manager again. Based on QR codes. So the bookmark functionality is not as important as the creation of a visual component, its reusability, and also, as I mentioned, the fact that we have multiple UI applications dealing with the same data. So first things first, we create a data model and we are going to name it bookmarks. Okay. Inside that we add a data type. And if you need a bookmark, you need an URL. And you're going to create a string property for the URL, another one for the name. And also, since we have bookmarks and we need to switch between them, we'll have the concept of, not here, but data type, the concept of active URL. And the active URL will have a single property, which is an URL. So here, this is something we haven't seen yet. You grab the brick, which is this one, URL, and you drop it over the relations, and it creates a relation to an URL object, and we are going to name that URL. So the active URL has one URL property of type URL. Based on that, we are going to generate the helpers. So here we are going to generate the getter and the setter for the URL, and we are also going to, here we just need a getter. Continue and close. And again, as we saw that before, we have our data model. We already have some bricks for the software intelligence APIs manipulating the data. And from that, we can start creating our application. So, but before creating our application, we said we want to create a visual component. And so, let's look into that. Visual component is this. So we are going to name it QR code, because unlike other bookmark managers, here it's going to be based on QR codes, right? So we open it, we enter a visual editor that we already saw, same as the one when you edit a screen, it's the same editor. And here what we want is a QR code. So we have the QR code viewer. Well, we can name QR code. We just drop label. So we need a label for the name and a label for the URL. Okay? So we can group those together. Yep. Here we go. And as we already saw, a group, let's rename that, has a layout, which is going to be vertical. Great. Here, the QR code, let's, make it look a bit nicer. And we'll have, so it's a vertical layout, so meaning like everything's going to be centered. And here, the width is going to be a percentage. Let's say 90%, and the height also, here we can say 70%. Great. The label fields, so 70% might be too big. Let's do that, 60. The name, we can enter some default dummy value, which is, let's say, website. And here we go, that we need to center this. Center. Okay, let's give it some bold style, like header 5. And the URL also can also be centered. Yep. And give it the width, which is, let's say, 90%. Same for the name. Why limit ourselves where we have the real estate and the URL? Just to have some visual feedback, we say HTTP something. Okay, great. Now the group itself can the group itself can have a background, so we see how big it is, and it can have rounded borders. Make it, well, 50 might be nice. So something interesting is here, you see it's stuck to the top. We don't have a margin, so we could reuse, we could create some subgroup to center it. Let's use a rectangle. The rectangle is here, and we are going to name it margin H, or let's say V margin. That's just for, okay. And here we are going to give it a height of 10, and its background color is going to be transparent. Boom. And here we see we have some margin. The URL itself, here the height, the default is too high, so we're going to say 30. And here we have something that starts to look correct. And the group itself, let's make it centered on the visual component, and we can also say it's 100% of the visual component, and the Y position is, it could be middle, it's the same because it's 100%. Okay, so we have that. Great. The goal of a visual component is to manipulate it so that viewed from the outside, the customer of the visual component doesn't know how it's designed internally. It doesn't need to know there are labels and the QR code, doesn't need to know all this. So we have in the spec and doc the signature of that, we have the summary, the description, we could use that, and we have properties. So we need to have properties on the visual component itself. And those properties are going to be a name and an URL. So if you use that visual component inside your application, you're going to have the break on the marketplace. So let's just, before we finish its implementation, we are going to look at how that happens. So we are going to create a UI app, and the UI app is going to be an URL UI app. It's just going to display the URL as a QR code, and once you're inside the editor, you should have that visual component here, QR code. And you see, here it is. So we can resize it. So it's not perfect, and that's not the point, is to design something perfect, but let's make it look nice, like this. Okay, great. And what we see is that break here has a help and says you have a name and an URL. And when you use it, you see that here it has a name and an URL. So we can center that so it works on all screens. We can right away fire it up. So here we have a running application. It has dummy values. That QR code shouldn't work, right? Because it's not defined. Okay? So that means that here if I edit this, I should be able to set a name and it should display it on the screen. Obviously it's not working because nothing is connected yet. So let's go back to my visual component and make it work. Okay, great. Name. So that's the general property. But what we are going to do is here, this label, you know, the name label, should display the name property of the parent visual component, the QR code. So how can we do that? You have the text. Instead of a hard-coded text, you press the F function key here, button. And here from the layers tree, you're going to grab the QR code and look for the name and get value, and you return that. And that's how you connect the two. Okay? Simple. And you are going to do the same for the URL. The URL has a function. You come here and you say, you look for the URL property, get value, and nicely done. And so here, if I'm on the QR code and I type a name, it should display it. Okay? Nice. But that also means that if I go back to my UI app and I type a name here, it should display. Okay? And here if I type something like HTTP, it appears here. But we see that the QR code itself is not updating. Well, the reason sounds obvious. And we are going to connect the QR code with the URL of the parent component. So here we have a value. Here we can try and we see the value updates the QR code. That's not what we want. We want to connect the function here. And here again, we grab the parent. We grab the URL, get value, and we connect that. And if we go back to the app, and here if I say, I select my visual component, I go back to the parent and I say HTTP, and you see it's updated dynamically. We put that here and we say wiki, and in the running application, the live app, if you scan that QR code, it should direct you to the Wikipedia page, which is here. But here, as we see, we still haven't connected anything to the data model or any data instance, which is going to be the next step. So how do we do that? Well, in a previous tutorial, we saw how to create bookmark instances. It's not the point of this tutorial, so we are going to create a few instances manually. So we are going to create an URL here, and we still have it in memory, so I paste it. I can add another one, name it Olympe Google. Great, we have some instances. We are going to create a second application, and that second application is going to be here. We are going to name it bookmarks, and that's where we are going to list all the bookmarks to trigger and update the URL app. So the URL app is still running. Okay, the bookmarks going to be super simple. We just need a drop down that we are going to center, and as usual we are going to run the app. You see, it's simple, empty. And here we have two ways to initialize a drop down: with an enum, we don't have any enum, or instances of a data model, and that's the object list. So we do that. And object list is what? Well, the usual get object list here of what data model? Well, all the URLs we know about, and we just return that. If I look at my live app, here we have them. So it doesn't look nice, right? But we know we have 3 instances, so this is the tag of the instance, and also we need to be more specific and display the right string. And a drop-down needs to have 2 methods initialized, the object list, but also the object to string, because here it tries to display an object instead of a string. So let's try to extract the string. The object here is an URL object, so we need to get the URL attributes, which is the brick we auto-generated with the helpers, drop-down. So we have the object, and we need to extract the name, and that's what we have, the name. If I had chosen the URL, I would have the URLs. But I want the name. So let's put back the name. And here's the name. Okay, great. But we see we can update it all the way we want. The URL is not changing. Wiki, Google, Olympe, Wiki. So yeah, it's correct. It's not plugged. So how do we make that connection happen? We just go back to our drop-down and we need to monitor the onChange. And onChange, what is it going to do? It's going to set the active URL. Okay, great. So set active URL. How do we do that? We have the active, get active URLs attributes. Okay, and set active URLs attributes. Okay, so we need to get the active URL. So we could do the usual get object list, but we are going to create an API for this so that the writing gets clearer. Okay, so we go back to the project, and we are going to create a new function, and we are going to name it get active URL. Okay. Get active URL. We need on output an active URL object, which is the other data type we created, active URL, and we say active. Okay, great. So here what do? We get an object list of type active URL. And here we have a list of active URLs. Okay, the way this tutorial is going to work is we're going to have only one instance of that. So we are going to get the first one in the list. And the first one is an active URL object. We could also, if we'd like to, return the URL property, which is a relation. Okay, and the URL is a property of the active URL. So we could say get active URL's attributes, and from the attributes we return also the URL object, right? As a reminder, here is the data model. So we get instances of that active URL, and then the attributes return the URL property, the relation, which is the one we want. Since we are not dealing with the creation of instances, let's also create such instance. So we have a default instance, so we don't need to deal with the constructor and the way to create it. Right? We saw how to do that in a previous tutorial. Let's not spend time on this. But we have a default instance here, and we just need to initialize its URL property. So here now there's no checkbox in the relation, meaning like there's no active URL information. There's an active URL instance of the object, but there's no active URL property. So we go back to our project, we go back to our bookmarks, and here, on change, we need to set, so we get the active URL, great. We have the active URL object instance, and we need to set that property. So we are going to set, oh, actually I didn't, it's funny, I didn't generate the helper, so let's go back here, I made a mistake. For some reason, I decided I wouldn't need it, but I discovered that I need it. and I'm going to generate the setter. Continue. Close. And I go back to my onChange, and I have the set active URLs attributes. Okay, so I want to set the active URL and I want to set the URL. We're not going to use this one because that's the current one. It would be resetting the value we currently have. We need to grab the one from the drop-down. So the drop-down has a selected value. It's an URL object. The property is the value that we want to set, and we plug in the control flow. And that normally should work. So let's refresh this to make sure we have it reset properly. I go back to my project. I go to my runtime data. I look at the properties of the active URL. None is selected. And I select something. Let's say Olympe. I go back to my runtime data and I see Olympe is checked. Great. Great. Now let's try to change it. Wiki. Oh, what do we see? We have 2 active URLs, and that's not possible, or else my application is not going to work. So why is that? Well, the reason is pretty simple. If you look at the set active URLs attribute, which is auto-generated from the data model, remember that? So let's open it and look at it. So we have a transaction, and within the transaction we create a relation. So each time we call this brick, which is set active URLs attributes, we set the relation, but we don't set it in a unique way. Each time we see that we create a new relation. So we created one with Olympe, and then we create a new one with Wiki. So what we need to do is make sure this is done in a unique way. So we are going to modify the logic of that brick. So first, we are going to delete all relations. All relations, okay, the origin object is the same that should go inside this one. So we redirect that here. And what is the relation? Well, the relation is active URL, right? Data type, active URL, relation URL. So we are going to here delete all relations of that type. So that means each time I call this, it's going to set a relation to make sure it's set uniquely. So we go back to the runtime data. We say Olympe. There you go. Olympe is set. If I switch back to Wiki, Wiki is set. If I do Google, Google is set. Great! So I have the concept of active URL being updated. Now we need to make the target app reflect this and display only the active one. So I go back to my project. I go back to the URL. And as we see, this is hard-coded. So instead of being hard-coded, we are going to implement a function which is getActiveURL. And because we already output the URL information, we just need to extract the attributes. And the attribute here is the name. Okay, great. And we are going to do the same for the URL itself. So here we say getActiveURL, get URL attributes. So that's an URL object, and here we return the URL string. So let's see if that works. Doesn't seem to work. Why is that? Where did I make a mistake? And so you investigate, and let's just do it. I select my code, I look at my implementation, I get into the name, everything looks good, so this is the right logic. This has been generated for me, so it's correct. Well, this is one break I did manually, so that might be where the problem comes from. And let's look at it. We get the active URL, we get the first object in the list, and we get the attributes. And the attributes, oh, it's not an URL, it's a list. Aha. Okay, so we have a list of relations, but as we said earlier, we need to pick up the first instance in the list because we change the logic so that there's always one instance when we add a relation. Okay, so that's where the problem comes from, and it's the get first object in list. That's where the problem comes from. And by the way, we should have seen that earlier, or I should have seen that earlier. Here we have like, you know, an error being popped up. I tried to connect a list to an URL. I went too fast recording this, I didn't pay attention. And if, let's say, okay, let's go back here for a second. And if we go to the Insights tab, it's telling me, wow, you made an error. So it was super obvious. I didn't pay attention. Yeah, so always pay attention. And so let's go back. Here, get active URL, and we are going to disconnect that. Connect the list to object. And now, normally, that should work. So here, wiki. If I change to Olympe, I have the Olympe QR code and URL being updated, and the same for Google. Okay, so we are done with this project. And to sum it up, we saw that we created a data model, right? Very simple. We saw the concept of relations, which we hadn't seen before in any of the previous tutorials. We created some software intelligence, some API to manipulate the data. We created our own visual component, reusable visual component. So now it would be as simple as making that public so it can be reused in any app externally. And here we have one app and another one, two apps running in parallel and dealing with the same instances, the same data model. We could create as many applications we want. So the power of the Olympe platform would allow you to, let's say, create an app for desktop browsers and another one, let's say, for a mobile phone. If you have less real estate, and you would give away the QR code of those to your customers, and so they would be able to scan it and run it on the phone. Those are very simple apps, but that's a possibility. Okay, thank you for watching, and see you in an upcoming tutorial.